I'm stuck on 95. But I did want to proceed with the presentation, even though it's a little unusual to be doing it remotely. So I spoke to you all a little bit yesterday, but today what I wanted to focus on is the element that where there were actually some questions raised yesterday about um, financial institutions supporting broadband, especially on the infrastructure side. So I've got a little PowerPoint, and I'll ask Bob to make sure he shares this with you. It's got some resources embedded in it. Next slide. So as we talked about yesterday, the CRA passed in 1977. The OCC has a rulemaking out to take a look at modernizing it. We're not quite sure where that's going to go, but we still have guidance from 2016 that talks about broadband in it. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think it's really critical to just always remember when approaching banks about projects that it's collaborative, it's innovative, and it's relational. So you should start with the relationships that you have with the banks and proceed that way. I've got some other pointers at the end of this PowerPoint as well. Next slide. So the interagency Q&A in 2016 is where broadband came into play with the CRA, and it's included as a form of infrastructure investment as an essential community service. Now, many people may remember that in the past, CRA was often used for water and sewer projects, but as time went on, cities and towns and communities in financing that, there came to be simpler ways of doing that. But, so now we're introducing broadband in the sphere where we don't have a lot of these alternatives for financing the broadband. There's also the CRA service test, which is banks can show evidence that their alternative delivery systems of online banking are being adopted and are effective in providing those services. So that's more that adoption side, the application side of the equation. And then in the elements around workforce development, we added job training examples in the Q&A, particularly small business development in terms of supporting technical assistance in the use of technology. So this is the guidance as it talks about broadband. And again, what I want to focus on today is not so much the application and adoption side, which I think Barry and I talked about quite a bit yesterday in the panel, but also to start you thinking about the financing side and how it could fit with infrastructure. Even though there are few examples out there, I think the few examples that there are can actually seed some ideas for how we could think about this in some other communities. Next slide. So this is pretty self-evident that, we need to deploy the broadband for competitiveness, job creation, innovation. I would just ask you to think about when you're looking at projects, especially infrastructure related to broadband, to think about that small business piece of the equation, since they are the backbone of the economy. Think about the job creation side of that and the workforce training. Those are critical metrics that banks use with CRA. So even though you might be thinking about a digital inclusion project that's focused on the schools, I would say think about some of these other side activities that can be conducted once this network is put in place, especially as it pertains to job creation and businesses. That can be a powerful element to attract a financial institution, as well as help them seek qualified credit for the activities they partake in. Next slide. So we've basically got broadband as an element of community economic development. We've got the infrastructure, you've got the applications as it pertains to workforce, education, access to financial services, small business development, affordable housing, and healthcare. So really this whole range should be options that are open to you in having conversations with financial institutions. And as much as you can connect that infrastructure to some of these applications, I think the stronger you'll be positioned in terms of furthering those conversations with banks. Next slide. This is just a good little chart that you can use as you're putting together, a project proposal or thinking through this as to how CRA lending, service, and investment can all fit into this equation with broadband. Next slide. All right, so I want to dive a little bit into the financing piece of it, and again, walk through a couple of examples. So that's where I wanted to spend most of my time today. So I think as we mentioned yesterday, there's just a whole range of community development finance tools out there. And we are seeing some of these tools being used for broadband infrastructure. Some have been around for a while. So I'll start with New Markets Tax Credit. That came about in 2000, targeted towards low-income tracts. Somewhat bureaucratic of a process that you go through with new markets, and those tend to be very large projects. I recently did a workshop teaching some community groups how to think about new markets tax credits, how they can team up with organizations that actually put those pieces together. So this is certainly something that can relate to CRA that you could think about in terms of infrastructure. And I'll also make available for Bob the slide deck and the recording of that webinar. And then I would just say that if any of you are thinking through new markets tax credits and you want to learn more about that, my colleagues across the Federal Reserve often do these workshops. And so that's another thing you could put on your to-do list, is to ask us to do a deep dive into new markets. Besides new markets, banks can engage in interim construction loans for a broadband infrastructure. Equity investments could be private investors, could be institutional investors, could be financial institution investors. Certainly, you've got layers of grants, federal, state, local, that could come into play. There's also the possibility of layering the broadband infrastructure in with low-income housing tax credits when you're doing affordable housing. Next slide. So this is a really complicated slide, and I'm not going to walk through all of it, but what I use this for is to emphasize just how creative you can be in terms of thinking about financing for broadband or for anything. This comes from a paper a colleague and I did on a redevelopment in East Baltimore. And what we did in the paper was we tracked all the financial transactions in this redevelopment. And then when we finished, I told her, I was like, I think this is interesting. I'm just not sure how many people are going to read all of these transactions. There was a lot of new markets tax credits, tax increment financing, a really interesting story of a university, a foundation, a hospital system, a community development corporation, and how they assumed different roles and changing roles in a changing economic climate in order to keep this redevelopment pushing forward. For example, the university used its procurement power to attract small business. They branded a hotel as part of it. A foundation stepped in to guarantee the tax increment finance bonds when the Great Recession occurred. But overall, this was phase one, 10 years, almost $1 billion project redevelopment of this segment of East Baltimore. And what this diagram shows is the blue boxes are all these different financing tools that you can think about really for any type of redevelopment project. The blue boxes are foundations, and there were a number of foundations involved. The pink boxes on here are actual physical entities that were created: schools, parks, affordable housing, development, university facilities. The gold boxes are developers who are part of it. The big green box is a nonprofit. And there's actually some more charts embedded within the paper. But it basically shows you how you can stack all of these different tools to arrive at a redevelopment plan that's expensive. So I think the same holds true as you think about broadband infrastructure. Some of these tools, some others, they can be stacked, and you can talk to partners very creatively about different types of roles that they can play. And I hope there's actually a project I'm going to talk about next that I'm actually going to be working on an attempt to chart out those transactions. But I just use this to give you some idea of how many tools there are in the toolbox and how creative you can be in terms of laying out the financing for a project. Next slide. So the latest tool we have in this is opportunity zones, where we have these qualified opportunity funds that can make equity investments. And I'm not saying that those are the be all end all, but I did put them sort of at the center of the spoke of the wheel because, again, I want to emphasize that we've got tax credits and subsidies. We've got CRA, different types of lending instruments, philanthropy. Now we have these opportunity funds. And this is really just more the world of community development finance and how you can layer and leverage capital to achieve projects. And for this group, that might be the infrastructure for broadband. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you some idea of all the different things you could think about in terms of how you could structure a financial deal for broadband. Next slide. I would add to that with the opportunity zones, the White House has created this Opportunity and Revitalization Council. And what they are doing is all of the federal agencies are on there. They're starting to prioritize the grant funding and loans to these opportunity zones, these low-income census tracts. So there's many, many potential actions in terms of how they may focus some of that funding. I know yesterday somebody mentioned disaster recovery. That's certainly one item that's on the list. USDA, different infrastructure, including rural broadband. There may be some priority put on that for the opportunity zones, SBA as well. I think that's just something out there to watch with NTIA and USDA to see where they may land in terms of prioritizing some of the programs that they already have. Next slide. So this is kind of the primary example that we have for broadband infrastructure using qualified CRA investment and lending. And this is, Barry mentioned this yesterday. This is RS Fiber Cooperative in Minnesota. It's a rural cooperative. And it's basically 10 cities formed a joint powers agreement board. And they did that in order to issue tax abatement bonds in several phases for construction of this infrastructure. They went tax abatement bond in order to sell it to the community, as opposed to going the property tax increase, which they knew would not be a popular option for the people in those communities. Basically, the service area is 6,000 households, businesses, farms, schools, public and private institutions, as well as hospitals. The project is fiber to the home, 700 square miles, and the development cost is about $53 million. Next slide. What they did in order to achieve this broadband infrastructure is multi-layered financing. So what I just showed you as to all those different tools and how that Baltimore redevelopment used those tools, that's what this project did. They basically sat down and started creatively constructing how they could layer some of these financing options. Banks were involved, federal, state, local government, a CDFI. We talked about community development financial institutions. There's one involved with this, a private foundation, private equity investors like you might find in qualified opportunity funds. And then they also used member revenues because they were creating a co-op. The initial investment from a bank It was $50,000 really for the feasibility piece of this and engineering and pre-development work. A bank stepped in and said, we will invest in this feasibility study to see if we can make this happen. That investment actually became a catalyst for construction financing among several different banks. So not just that one bank, other banks got involved. And I can't emphasize enough that even though banks compete, when you're working on redevelopment, broadband, Community Reinvestment Act activities, banks like to collaborate. It reduces their risk, and it's one area where you'll see them come together around affordable housing. And in this case, they came together around broadband financing. The bank also used PWI authority, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is public welfare investment. And they used that as well to sort of seed the fact that they were investing in this broadband infrastructure. In the phase one of the construction, you had bonds, public and private debt, grants, these equity investments. You had member payment for wireless towers, and they brought in an additional 17 townships in the area. So 10 cities, they brought in 17 other townships in the phase one construction part of it. Next slide. The banks, as far as Community Reinvestment Act, we had this initial investment for the feasibility. Then we had banks come in and provide construction credit. And then we actually had the original bank that did the investment in the feasibility also became a stockholder with preferred stock in the fiber using this Public Welfare Investment Authority under CRA. Rural Electric Economic Development Loans and Grants. The CDFI stepped in with some debt financing on the construction. And then there were a couple of other different grants from and loans from USDA. Next slide. So basically, this infrastructure project in Minnesota is like our best example. We have some other banks that are, kind of in different phases and talking to cooperatives, talking to local governments about how to piece together fiber. But this is really our best example, and it's a great example of how you can think about the different financing options to roll it together. Now, I mentioned Public Welfare Investment Authority. So I just want to say a little bit about that. That comes from the OCC as the regulator of national banks. And so what it basically says is that national banks can make investments directly or indirectly to promote the public welfare. They can do this with housing, services, jobs. And I've given you the citation for the investment authority and the regulation. So again, it's promoting public welfare by providing these services. That's what the bank used in Minnesota as it to substantiate its CRA investment and lending in the infrastructure project. So by investments, we mean equity investments as well as debt investment. Now, that project also had equity investment by private investors, but the bank was able to make that. Again, you've got a layered approach, and they justified that with this public welfare argument that's available under the statute. Public welfare investment can be used to support affordable housing, other real estate development. It can be justified for startups and expansions of small business. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the relationship between CDFIs and banks around CRA. It can be used to substantiate those investments in CDFIs and really any activities that help to revitalize or stabilize a government designated area. Now, I will point out that in the guidance, you can read this last piece that goes back to enterprise zones and some of those other categories. That does not say opportunity zones right now, and I can't answer whether that may be included in the guidance at some point. But under this public welfare investment authority that OCC has set forward for national banks that they regulate, these are some of the ways they can use that authority. And this was what was used with that infrastructure project in Minnesota. Next slide. The other financial institutions that are regulated by FDIC and the Federal Reserve follow some different PWI rules. This is kind of one of those areas where we all regulate different types of banks. Federal savings associations are supervised by OCC, and they have some slightly different regulations that they follow. The non-member state banks are supervised by the FDIC. Member state banks and holding companies are supervised by the Federal Reserve System. So basically what we always say is we've got some specifics here with OCC, and I certainly don't want to speak for them in terms of the public welfare investment, but we have this great example of broadband infrastructure using that PWI with OCC. But for other financial institutions, we strongly suggest that they come back to their regulators about PWI to make sure that it's consistent with the regulations that we set forth. But still an option on the table. We just ask them to come back and consult with us. The next slide are some resources we talked a little bit about yesterday. So I've given you some links in here. When Bob gives you this PowerPoint, you'll have these links of the things I mentioned, Fed communities, so a case study for thinking about how to put something together for a bank around the digital divide, some other articles that we've written, as well as kind of a worksheet to help you think about some of these projects. And I've got the OCC's resource page on here as well. Next slide. So this is just a little bit about the template that we put together that can really help you think about how to structure a 1 or 2 page brief for a presentation to a bank around broadband. It can walk you through the infrastructure side as well as the adoption and application side, and just help you think about what metrics, how you might want to frame the discussion with the bank. So just a good tool in terms of taking your vision that you may have around broadband and kind of putting it down on paper. We also use this with the banks to help them think about how they could look at projects that you might bring to them. Next slide. And then this is the link to the case study. The New York Fed came up with a hypothetical case study. Again, just another tool you can click on to use to think about how your project might fit, you know, with that investment lending or service test, and how you might want to frame that before you have a conversation with a bank. Next slide. I'm a North Carolinian. I can't help but put a North Carolina resource on here. This is the North Carolina Broadband Office's Community Playbook, which I think is a really good tool as well to think about the partnerships and how you could structure some of this. It's got a lot of different resources in there and some other ideas to think about how you might approach on funding. So I think it's a good holistic approach that's worthwhile for anybody in any state to take a look at. And then I'll finish up before I take questions, but kind of my hit list on things for you to think about with respect to CRA as you're, you know, you all have some ideas and some visions you want to see in play, and how you might think through some of those things with approaching a financial institution. So just keep in mind that a bank's number one guidance is they want a financially safe and sound strategic partnership. So you may need to think about putting, you know, some financials together for your organization. If you've got a collaboration of organizations, you know, just think about how you might substantiate the fact that you are fiscally safe and sound, and a good partner for them to do business with. That also holds true true for reputation. These are things the bank would be concerned about. This is a federal regulation. They're documenting. They have to meet the regulations, so they need partners that are reputationally sound. The little template that you can walk through spends quite a bit of time about measurable milestones, how the mission might qualify for credit, some of those things. I think it gives you some nice language that you can use, as well as some guidance on thinking about those metrics. I always tell community organizations, the more metrics you can bring to the table, you're saving you're actually saving the financial institution a lot of time. You're also substantiating it. And, you're really making the argument that this is to the benefit of the low and moderate income communities that CRA is designed around. So any of those metrics as to how many people you're going to reach, um, census tracts where they are, um, substantiating the low and moderate income, any of those pieces that you can fold into your initial presentation are going to be helpful. Likewise, being specific about exactly how you want to use the funds, and then how using those funds is going to have an impact not only on the LMI community and people, but also your organization, your collaborative, as well as the financial institution. So how can that impact actually help that financial institution? They're there to do business. If you can show them how this may result in them having additional deposit holders, how this is going to help them reach more people with their mobile banking applications, you would want to point out those things, because that is going to help match up with the bank's strategic plan. And that was kind of my last point on this slide, is that it's important to know what a bank's plan is and how you can fit into that plan. And you'll know that by asking them what their focus is on CRA. And if a bank is a small business lender and that's what they do and that's what they do well, and that's the model of the bank, and there are many banks out there like that, you're going to need to approach them with some element around small business, because they're not going to change their business model for your project. Rather, you need to think about how your project can fit in their business model. And that's that relational piece. You can ask, the OCC, community affairs folks, you can ask us in the Federal Reserve what we think about a bank, what we believe their model to be. And you can also ask the bank directly, so that you can help fit your program into what their strategic plan is. Next slide. Some other hints for me to wrap up on is the least served areas can be the greatest opportunity for a bank, and the competition might be minimal. So I think in many cases, if you can show that there's this area that has really been neglected, hasn't been served, that could be a good way to bring a financial institution in play. Now, I said competition is least, so in some cases, it might be very collaborative with multiple banks if it's a large infrastructure project. If it's an adoption or an application project, it might be that the bank might be more enticed by a place where nobody else is doing that work and it's something new and innovative. I always remind people that with CRA, there is a peer review element to that. If 10 banks are doing something and 2 banks aren't, the examiners may ask those 2 banks why they're not doing what the other banks are. So it can go both ways, collaborative as well as competitive. And you just need to think about that as you're positioning your project. Certainly using government programs, government grants, loans as resources to entice a bank. You saw in the Minnesota example, there were a number of federal loans and grants. Banks like to hear that, because that mitigates their risk. It shares the risk across multiple entities. And then, frankly, if the federal government agency or entity has found it, to be worthy of that type of financial support, that's probably going to be something that gives a bank an incentive to take a second look at it. Be strategic, make sure that you're targeting whatever you want the bank to do to those LMI individuals and geography. And, just always keep in mind that a bank has this total community development goal that they're trying to fulfill as part of their CRA. So where you can step in and help them with that is going to make your project extremely viable. And with that, Bob, I'm going to stop and then see if there are any questions, because I know that was a lot. And but hopefully, when people have the PowerPoint, they can click through the links. And as always, feel free to contact me if they have questions.
We're using like 5 different technologies here.
Jeannie, can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Excellent. Okay, so Bonnie Bracey Sutton had a question for us, which is, I'm sorry, the echo is kind of disorienting for me. But the question is, would the Federal Reserve and OCC and FDIC be interested in collaborating with us on producing a guide for the State Financial Technology Directors Association on how to make these kinds of investments, CRA investments for broadband? Does that do justice, Bonnie, to your question? A toolkit guide.
Yeah.
Basic idea.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. Like, I really have started trying to map out, graphically that Minnesota project, because I think that there are a lot of different, tweaks that we could use with that model with other projects. And I think that and some of the others lend themselves very nicely to a toolkit. So, I can say on behalf of, me, and I think my colleagues would agree that that would absolutely be something that we could collaborate on.
Uh-oh. I see. Jeannie, can you hear us? You're muted. Try it again. Try again, Steve.
With respect to new market tax credits, it's good. I've muted the speakers.
Can Jeannie hear you? Can you ask Jeannie?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay. With respect to new market tax credits, is CRA the sole funding source?
CRA could potentially fit with a new market tax credit. New market tax credits come from a fund in the Department of Treasury. So that has its own funding mechanism. But it is a possibility for broadband infrastructure development, just like it is for lots of other redevelopment types of activities. Restoration for buildings. It tends to be very large projects. I think the average on a new markets tax credit might be around $10 million. So not the feasibility piece, but building out the facility. So I would label it as an option to consider in a broadband infrastructure project.
Thank you, Jeannie. This is Tara Burke, University of Maryland. My question is about the Minnesota project. Did they reserve the right to sell broadband access to third parties on their service as a revenue generation model?
They did. They haven't, they're in phase 2 right now, so they haven't done that yet, but that is in their organizational structure up front to be able to do that.
Okay, Jeannie, I think we're set, and I want to thank you profusely. This is tremendously helpful, and clearly a very essential food group, and everything we're all here for. Can you hear me okay, Jeannie?
I can, and I just want to remind the group that, as they're thinking through their projects, people like me and others across the system, very much, enjoy brainstorming and helping them kind of formulate these ideas. So I just don't want anyone to hesitate to reach out to, get a thought partner on these projects.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeannie. This is fabulous. Can we all give her a hand, please? And hopefully Jeannie, you can hear us. And safe driving, and hopefully you can get back home and get off of I-95 soon. Hey, so we'll transition. There's an echo. Oh, because I have to mute the Zoom. Mute the Zoom. Let me mute. Should I just?
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to look at how I mute. Is it?